You are listening to the Senior Pastor Podcast, where four giants of the Restoration Movement walk us through the issues facing the church today. Your four hosts are Bob Russell, Don Wilson, Ken Idleman, and Scott Rawlings. Before we begin, a word from our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Brooke Brotzman, CEO and founder of Go Ministries. Go Ministries empowers local leaders to make disciples. After 30 years of leading this ministry, the next generation is taking it to a whole nother level. And I have had the privilege of starting a new area called Go Legacy, where we focus on pastoral care, resourcing new initiatives, and teaching and modeling kingdom generosity. If you'd like to learn more, please go to gomen.org. We all leave a legacy. What will your legacy look like?
Welcome again to the Senior Pastor Podcast. I'm Matt Rawlings. I am the teaching pastor at Christ Community Church, and I am joined as always by Bob Russell, the founding pastor of Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, and Dr. Don Wilson, the founding pastor of CCV in the Phoenix area, Ken Idleman, the former president of Ozark Christian College and lead pastor at Crossroads Christian Church, and Scott Rawlings, a.k.a. my dad, the founding pastor of Christ Community Church. So we've talked a lot about building teams, whether they be staff members or volunteers, but unfortunately there is often a time, and Bob actually kicked this off with his first hire, when you have to dismiss someone. And so other than red flags, I know at Christ Community Church, we sign an employee contract that basically says if there's pornography found on your computer or your phone or whatever, or there's evidence that you've had an affair or you get a DUI or use, drugs or so forth, and you're automatically dismissed. But what is the process, looking back on your ministry, that you did or you wish you had done when it comes to dismissing team members? Bob, start with you.
Well, Scott mentioned earlier about we can learn from corporations and the secular world some basic principles about hiring and firing. And early on, we didn't have those practices, and it was really awkward when it came time to let somebody go. But I think the church, especially larger churches, have done much better in having annual evaluations and then giving some cautions and expectations, so that when somebody is let go, you have a paper trail, and they are not surprised. Generally, they should know when they are terminated that it was coming. Early on, we would just murmur and mumble and then get angry enough to confront somebody and release them. But I think going in, they should know what the red flags are and what is expected of them, and then they should have regular evaluations so they know when they're not meeting that target. And a lot of times people will find another job or dismiss themselves rather than having to be terminated.
Don, what about you?
Boy, I think this is very sticky and very difficult in our culture today. If I look back, I had two different situations where there was a worship pastor that I found out was involved sexually with some people, and we handled it behind the scenes and never came public with the church, afraid of lawsuit. If I would go back and do that again, I'd have taken the risk of the lawsuit and made it known. The other time, we had a counseling pastor that had an affair, and we did have him up front, he and his wife in front of the church, where we acknowledged the situation and said we would do everything we could to try to get them counseling and help and restore them to ministry. But I think today, the HR is going to get involved. And HR, how are you going to protect yourself from lawsuits? I'm going to shoot straight. I don't really know the answer and all that. I just think you have to do what you think that God wants you to do. And I think one of the major things that we as preachers need to do when somebody on our staff is immoral or has broken a character covenant and they go to another church to interview, we might get sued again, but I think we need to let other preachers know. You better check out the background of this person, and that's one struggle I find today. We let people that have improper character go to other ministries and never let the other church aware. And I really think we have a responsibility to do that. How you do it and not get sued, I don't know the right answer.
Well, and Don, I heard someone the other day say, times have changed in not for the better in the fact that now HR seems to run the world, and that is not a good cultural turn.
I have some business guys that are really good friends of my small group. They're in major corporations. And I said, what major change would you change in your corporate structure? And they said, we made a mistake when we turned our organization over to HR. And I would say that is happening in a lot of our churches right now. The HR department is growing bigger and bigger. We need to protect us legally, but in fact, that's part of the problem when you allow your HR team to do most of the hires and the interviews instead of the pastor. That's what I see in the larger church, not the smaller church.
I agree. Ken, what do you say?
Well, it's never a good experience to terminate someone who's been a part of the team because it feels like excommunication to them. Particularly if it's in a local church, they not only lose their job, they also lose their Christian community. And so that's why it's vitally important to do a good job in the hiring process and the vetting process up front. But once you've realized that a person needs to be terminated, that their effectiveness is spent, I think it's really important to discern whether it's a character issue or it's a competence issue. If it's a character issue, then I think sometimes we're too slow to release someone who has demonstrated that they don't have the kind of spiritual maturity and the kind of spiritual leadership to remain in the employ of the church. And so if it's a competence issue, I think in the course of your performance evaluations, you can say, well, we need 6 months to see you really demonstrate a heart for what you're doing and to demonstrate effectiveness in it, and give them some time to kind of do better at whatever the areas of deficiency are, and those need to be identified in the context of your employee evaluation process. But I think sometimes we're too quick to hire and too slow to release, and so I think sorting out whether it's a character issue or a competence issue and handling it very differently in both of those. Unfortunately, I've been in that position many, many times through the years at the college with a staff of about 160 or 70. It seemed like there were always changes that were being made and people who were coming and going.
Yeah, and it's to go back to a point Don made in the earlier podcast that the hiring process is key, but also the evaluation, regular evaluations, and goals, not just job descriptions, but goals. Right? That's a real key. Dad, you worked in the private industry in corporate America for several decades. And one of the things you told me was, what we do in the churches is we tell you we got to let you go. We're going to give you 30 days. But in the corporate world, they tell you to let you go. The security guard walks you to your office and you clear out your desk and you're gone. And do you think that applies to the church world? Or
I wish I had a time or two here at church, but I've had a tendency to it wasn't a fear of dealing with it. I just, when people have been with you for a while, you love them, and and you know it's going to hurt them, and it's just a difficult thing to make yourself do it. I have a friend actually owns a place where Alice Kay and I live. We talk about this on occasion, and his motto is, I'm slow to hire and quick to fire. And churches will stay away from that just because it looks bad. But that's not, if it's, I'll pick on Bob a minute. We actually hired a guy here from Southeast Church and brought him. He had a wonderful personality. He wasn't lazy. He was a good person. But, he could not write a sentence with a subject and a predicate. He couldn't do that. Everything that he wrote, we had to do all over again. I finally, I don't have that kind of time. And I told him we either have to find some place where you don't have to write anything or something because we don't want to let you go. But finally we had to and he was a college graduate.
He was a sermon writing team.
And I wanted to send him back to Southeast, but I love the guy. He did everything you asked him to do, and sometimes you're just in a pickle. But you're talking about the HR thing. There's two things here that need to be said. Number one, and it's been mentioned before, who is he work for? Because if you don't have that clear, they will go back then over your head to the elders, and unless the elders there are fully aware and in a position to support you, you ought to always know who are they working for, and here they work for me, and that has to be clearly understood. And the other thing is, if you have a large church and have an HR department, because in business I had a large staff in HR, but they understood. I would say, I want you to hire this guy here. You take care of it. And if they were hiring a janitor, I didn't care about that. I didn't mess with that. But if it's somebody that was, because I operated as a chief operating officer, and I wanted them to know they work for me. And if that's clearly understood, you don't have much of a problem.
Scott, don't you think there's a difference, though, hiring somebody or firing somebody in the business world and firing somebody in the church? In the business world, they're gone. Yeah. But in the church, you have to weigh the unity factor much more heavily than you do in the business world.
And and when you've worked with somebody for a year or two or three or four, and you got to know them and you know their family and you love them, I mean, it's painful to have to do that.
It's impacting everybody in the church, at least in their circle of influence. It
is. Yes, and a small church, a smaller church, 500 or under, that's really a big deal.
Matt, it occurred to me, we're talking with listening to a lot of preachers that are listening here in small churches, and they're struggling. And I would say to them, when you go to be interviewed as a pastor of a church, you as well ought to be interviewing the church that you're going to. Because if the church has a bad reputation of firing preachers every 2 years, what makes you think they're going to keep you any longer? So I would say that. Another thing I would say, how you leave is how you'll be remembered. You can have a long-term ministry, but if you go out divisive and sour, that's how you're going to be remembered. So if you're a pastor and you are in a difficult situation, no matter how difficult it is, do your best to leave in a godly way, and that's the way that I think you're going to be remembered.
How you say hello, and how you say goodbye.
Yeah,
are the two most important times in a relationship. How you welcome people in the front door, and how you excuse them out the back door if you have to. I think one of the most gratifying experiences I had in leadership at Crossroads, we had hired a man who had been a consultant to oversee our sound and technology and so on at the church. He'd been a consultant, so he was on staff, but he did not take any responsibility for leading his volunteer team really effectively. He was still a consultant, functioning like a consultant, and he would come in when he wanted to, and he would be gone in the middle of the day, and nobody could find him, and so he continued to operate like a consultant, even though he was an employee. So we had talked with him about this and tried to work with him because he was very good. But eventually we had to let him go. And I remember I always did terminating on Friday afternoon when nobody was going to be around, around 4:00 Friday afternoon. By 5:00, everybody's gone. And if somebody is going to leave in an unpleasant way, they're not going to have an audience. And so I had him come into my office and sat across from him, and I said, Brian, as you know, we've been working with you and trying to help you transition from being a consultant to being a staff member, and it's clear that we're just pushing you in areas that you are not comfortable, and you're a square peg in a round hole. You're just not a fit with your method of operating. There wasn't anything wrong with his character. Anything, he was a faithful member of the church. And anyway, I finished, and I was interested in his reaction. He reached across the table and he stuck out his hand and he said, "Thank you." He said, that is the nicest way that I have ever been fired in my life. I wish I could all go like that.
90% of the time when you let somebody go, within a week, they'll show you why. And their reaction and their willingness to create trouble in the church often reveals that. You've seen the movie Moneyball, when the owner of the team schools his understudy about how to release a guy. He said, there's no easy way to do it. You just have to come right to the point and say, here's what happened. But there are a couple of observations. One is that whenever you let somebody go, no matter how incompetent they are, somebody's going to rally to their cause. There are people in the church who feel bad for an underdog, or they've been in that situation. And you may think everybody in the church is going to understand, but there may be a group of people who get upset no matter how incompetent somebody is, and you have to live with that. But the other thing that surprised me is when you let somebody go, you gain respect as a leader. Especially from people who are leaders in the corporate world, they see that you have the courage to make the tough decision. Remember years ago when Ronald Reagan was president, he warned the air traffic controllers if they didn't come to work on Monday, they would be released. And they called his bluff, and he released them. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, there was kind of a national rallying behind the president. Somebody was in charge here. And if you make the tough choices, you gain respect as a leader.
Yeah, I learned that, Bob, when we had our church split. The people who were the anchors of our church, the guys who stayed, were business leaders because they respected my father. And, small business owners or leaders of corporations, they weren't swayed by it. They stayed with, they understood and they stayed. Do you think it's a good idea? Because we are talking to a lot of young pastors with growing churches, many of them with the Solomon Foundation, Ken, but one of the things that I respect that Dad has done is you sign an employee contract, and the employee contract is that if there's a moral issue, it's an automatic fire. It's not, there's no debate. If there is evidence of an affair, pornography, a DUI, drug use, whatever, you're gone. There's no debate over this. And so that's just there in the employee contract. And, competence is another issue, but morality is an obvious issue. Don, what do you think of that?
Well, I think, again, you have to, you get not what you expect, but what you inspect. So if you don't have them sign that kind of an agreement when you start or hire them, then definitely they'll be caught off guard when you bring it up. So I think how you start your hiring process and how you start the process is going to make a lot of difference, and you won't have to come back and change a lot of things down the road. So I think most churches are probably not that clear in their hiring process. Mm-hmm. For example, never reward expected behavior. See, that sounds like a total different thing. But I grew up in a culture where you did what you were supposed to do, and you didn't get a reward for that. Nowadays, because everybody gets a trophy for everything, they expect just doing their job and showing up, they're going to get a raise. So I think you have to be very clear in what's expected of me, what happens when I improve, how much vacation. The more you spell out, probably the less problems you'll have when you get ready to let them go. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, Dad, even you've got in the contract, because you're diehard for Crown Financial and all that kind of stuff, even if they have too much debt or whatever. So talk to that, Dad. I mean, when did you come up with that contract and that employee contract, which I had to sign, and saying those things and why?
Well, I became a friend with he was on the board of one of our corporations, who was the he taught contract law at Ohio State, and he put it together for me, and it had already been a modified. He modified one that he had put together for one of the companies that he sat on the board for, and I saw it, and he explained to me why we needed to do it to avoid, because he was a Christian man, and he wanted the church to avoid lawsuits by proper preparation in hiring and firing, and so that's why we used it, and that's where it came from.
I remember it wasn't released from employee, but it was dismissing some students at the college years ago. We had some students that were exposed, male students, in homosexuality, and we dismissed 7 students for homosexual behavior. And I remember that we had an 11 o'clock meeting in the chapel. We asked all the faculty to come in, the staff to come in, the student body to come in. The building was packed, and I had to stand up and address this. And one of the things I said was, I know all these students have circles of friendship, and you're going to be tempted to be defensive of them, and don't make that mistake. This is important for them. This is a corrective searing in their spiritual lives, and they don't need sympathizers. They need people who will love them with tough love. And to your point, Bob, about the respect that you get as a leader when you fire for good reason, or when you dismiss for good reason. I can remember the impact that had on the student body, the positive impact of, we're a part of a college here that is serious about right and wrong, moral and immoral, good and evil, and the standards are high here, and we want to be a part of a school. We want to be a college student at a college that has high standards.
And let me, before we go to Ad, Bob, get your comment on that. I think we're all in agreement that for those, these pastors who are listening with growing churches and so forth, many of them thanks to Solomon, is it important to have an employee contract with morality clauses in there, which is just an automatic fire so they know what's
I think
expected?
That's essential, especially in this day and age, because they'll turn around and sue you for false accusations or wrongful dismissal, and it has to be understood right up front. Years ago, however, when I started, that wasn't the case. One of the first times that we had to dismiss somebody, we only had 3 people on staff, and I discovered on Friday that our worship leader was involved in an affair, and that was cause for immediate dismissal. But here I am in my late 20s, early 30s, and I don't know what to do. So I called the chairman of the elders, and he said, let's have an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. And the elders really counseled me through what I was to say to the congregation. And so they advised me to get up on Sunday morning and say, this staff member has been dismissed because there's been a family problem. Please pray that the family will be reconciled. But in the meantime, if you need additional information, the elders will be in the lobby afterward, and you can talk to them individually. Let's stand for prayer and worship. if I had to deal with that situation without the counsel of the elders, I'm sure I was angry. I would have thrown the guy under the bus. I would have given too much information, but I gave just enough that they realized that there was a moral problem, but not so much as to be an embarrassment. And if they needed additional information, it was available to them. I think so many times we're not transparent enough with the congregation. We don't trust the church enough by giving them the information. And we sweep things under the rug, and for months later, they're pulling back the rug trying to find out. That's the seedbed for rumors and discontent. And I had a woman call me the next week and say, Bob, there's a rumor going around that this worship leader had an affair with a woman in the choir. I said, that's not a rumor, that's the truth. And you know what? The rumors subsided and the church was pretty united and we went on. But I think, again, the help, the teamwork with the elders in making these decisions, and then the communication with the congregation, giving them enough information is really important for the harmony and the future of the church.
Thank you. So we're going to take a minute to hear a word from our sponsor. Thanks to Go Ministries, and make sure you check them out to help form your legacy.
Hi, I'm Brooke Brutzman, CEO and founder of Go Ministries. Go Ministries empowers local leaders to make disciples. After 30 years of leading this ministry, I have turned it over to the next generation and couldn't be more pleased with how they're leading and all they're doing. That allows me to focus on a new area called Go Legacy, where we focus on pastoral care, resourcing new initiatives, and kingdom generosity. And folks, let's face it, if you're connected at all with the church, whether a regular attender, an elder, and certainly if you're on staff, you see the pressures that our leaders are under. It is an incredible burden that they bear and often bear alone. Go Ministries has been privileged to walk alongside hundreds of local leaders right here serving in our own churches. And we want to do more through counseling, encouragement, and equipping those pastors. But that doesn't happen without new initiatives and new resources. And that brings us to kingdom generosity. Folks, God owns it all, and we need to live into that each and every day. Please go to gomin.org and ask yourself, what will your legacy look like?
Gentlemen, before we quit, we need to touch on a sensitive topic. We have been talking about moral issues and competency issues. I think we've addressed the competency issues. You know, Don, I think, made a very good point that, look, you've got to give people goals, not just a nebulous job description. You got to give them goals, to hit. And more than an annual review, especially today, which I think is important advice. One of the things we, of course, are confronting in our culture before we quit is people and their genders and homosexuality and, all that other kind of stuff. Dad, I want to start with you because I know you've had to dismiss people in the time I've been at the church for homosexual activity. And it's changed a lot since then because that was several decades ago when you had to do that. But approaching that even then is a sticky wicket.
Yeah, I would have probably created a real problem if you hadn't stopped me, because we've had that people show up who are girls in particular who want to be boys, and the use of the bathrooms. And I was inclined to just put a sign on the doors of each of the toilets all over this place that, you use the bathroom of the gender you were born with. And because it just sort of gets under my skin, and I'm such a tolerant person to start with. And I would have probably...
Well, to be fair to you, you won't say this, but you often sit down and have coffee with a self-identified gay man who was a city councilman. You used to sit down with him all the time.
He's a friend. Yeah, we've invited him into our home, and we've talked with him because I know, because of previous experience, that homosexual guys can indeed be converted and have their life changed, marry a woman, have children, and years later be glad. I've got it in writing in my office. It's guarded. You can't get to it unless you pay me a lot of
the
money.
Apostle Paul said Apostle Paul said the same thing. So you're in good company.
See, in our culture today, that's really an offense to a lot of people, that you can actually be converted and have your life changed from a life of sin and degradation to a life that honors God. And I know I could name names and places and so on, but you don't. You protect people, and I know the power of God to change lives, and I won't back off of that for anybody.
Yeah. And so, Ken, your son Kyle is the lead pastor at a large church in Louisville, Southeast Christian. I'm sure that Southeast has had to deal with this.
Yes, and I honestly, I'm not involved in that or knowledgeable about that side of the inner workings of the church, and it's intentional. I just I stay away from that, and I feel like that's my son's domain. He's been his own man for a long time, and I have a incredible confidence in him. He is honestly, and you got to allow for strength.
Oh, he's done fairly well for himself, Ken, I would say. But but you also were a college president. College presidents are having to deal with this. Students or faculty coming out as gay, as transgender, and so forth. And I've tried to help them when I worked for ADF. I helped them write bylaws and so forth, protect them from that. But churches and institutions are dealing with this. And
yes.
I mean, if you could give like college presidents or anyone else any advice about this, what would you say?
Well, there's just so much compromise that's happening out there. I think we've got to absolutely draw some lines, and I'm rather like Scott here. I'm not going to be very accommodating. The whole gender dysphoria thing is just it's a hellish trend that there are young kids that are taking gender altering drugs and having surgeries, and we're going to have a whole generation of very angry, very bitter adults, and a lot of suicide rates that are connected to this whole transgender thing that is a spinoff of same-sex attraction and lesbianism, homosexuality, and I realize that we've got to speak the truth in love, but I think that the truth is that we are not going to hire employees that are gender confused or that are same-sex involved, and we're not going to apologize for it. And if we get sued, we get sued, and we deal with it. And there just is a real need for us to speak where the Bible speaks in this area. And the assault on marriage and the family in our generation is unprecedented in these United States. And there's got to be some places where people are like Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida.
Yeah, but I mean, this is becoming an issue. I don't know. I know Bob, Don, both of you. You mentor a lot of young pastors. This is becoming an issue, and it's going to become an increasing issue. Don, I know that, one of the things that you have pushed in your ministry is that if you're a man on stage, you need to imbibe a biblical masculinity. And so when you're mentoring, if you're mentoring a young pastor and he's got somebody on staff or somebody in the congregation who's coming out, transitioning, whatever, what would you mentor them to do, Don?
Well, I'll answer your question a little differently. We had a preschool child that the family came to us and he was playing with dolls and they wanted to go through a sex change and wanted a church to reinforce it. And I said, no, we would not do that. And they left the church. However, I think if we're going to have a witness to the unchurched community, sexual sin is sexual sin. And so if we take a strong stand on gays and lesbians, but don't take a strong stand on living together. There's so many people in our Christian churches that are living together, and we let them live together. The issue of pornography is epidemic in the church. And so I think where we lose our witness, though, is we take a strong stand on one area of sexual dysfunction, but we're not consistent throughout. So to me, it's that balance of grace and truth, never sacrifice truth, but at the same time, we got to figure out how to give grace. That's the balance. But we can't pick and choose on the sexual sin today. We need to take a strong stand on all kinds, to me, of sexual sin.
Yes, good point.
Yeah. And I want to end this with Bob. Bob, I worked for 8 years for Alan Sears, who's a Louisville native, who was the head of ADF for, oh my gosh, I don't know how many years, going back to 1993 when James Dobson and you know, all those guys founded it. And so I know you've met, you know, Alan, and you're aware of what ADF was doing to fight for marriage and so forth. And Alan went to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary back in the 80s before Al Mohler, your buddy, took it over. And guys, if you don't know, Al Mohler told me that Bob Russell was his only friend back in the early 90s when he took over Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. But one of the, you know, people that was teaching theology at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary was the first person to die of AIDS. He was a gay man in Louisville. So I know you've dealt with this for a long time, but today it's an epidemic with people, you know, whether they're, and if you're dealing with staff members, volunteers, so forth, and they're talking about their support of people transitioning or so forth, what do you say to them as a pastor?
You know, I think there are three kinds of churches today. There are the liberal churches that are endorsing all kinds of sexual perversion, performing same-sex marriages, endorsing transitions. Then you have churches that make it very clear where we stand, and they're bold, and they're taking a lot of hits from the world. And then we have a whole lot of churches in the middle who really believe the basics of biblical marriage, but try to remain silent so they don't get any hits. And they're hiding in the caves and the rocks, hoping that eventually the tide will turn and they won't be so unpopular with their stand. And I'm calling on preachers to have a new boldness. We can't let 20% of the culture that is outspoken and angry and loud to intimidate what I think are the vast majority of people who have some common sense on these issues and believe in traditional values. The best example that I can point to recently is a friend of mine. Heath Lambert is the preacher of the First Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. And they came out several months ago with a basic statement, a positive statement about sexuality in marriage. And there's nothing negative. It just says, here's what we believe as a church that God intended for marriage and the family to be. And to be a member of the First Baptist Church in Jacksonville, you have to be willing to sign that covenant that here you believe what the Bible says about marriage. That, in his understanding, protects them from future lawsuits if they don't hire somebody because of their sexual orientation. But the stuff hit the fan, and they got a lot of negative press and in social media and in the newspaper and television about excluding certain classes of people. And so Heath just a week or two ago had an open mic one night and invited everybody in the community to come in. And we talk about a great balance of truth spoken in love. He maintained his composure, took a strong stand, and said, this is what this church believes and why. And when it was over, it was a sigh of relief that it was over, but everybody in the church was proud to be a part of a church that took a stand. And I don't think we can hide anymore. we just got to say, here's where this church stands. Here's what we believe. We love people. We hope that you allow God to change your life. If you're living together without marriage, you need to repent of that. If you're divorcing without justification, you need to get back into your marriage. If you're thinking about your child transitioning, you need to repent of that and understand that God has made two genders, and speak the truth in love, and don't worry about the lawsuits. Don't worry about what the community is going to say. Communicate the truth and let God take care of us from there.
Amen. So I want to just wrap this up real quickly by pointing out a number of things, takeaways that I have heard from these men who have been doing ministry for decades. When hiring, be very careful, go beyond the references. I love Don's suggestion, interview both the husband and the wife. And I think that's a very wise suggestion. And, make sure that you have very clear goals for your employees, and also make sure that you also just really have regular reviews, not just annual reviews, but every, like as Don said, maybe every 3 months or something like that, where you go over those goals and so forth, and that you encourage people. But you also make sure that your volunteers know what's expected of them, have background checks, show them appreciation, and also make sure that in your churches that when you hire someone, it is very clear in their employee contract what's expected of them morally, and also those goals. So that's just some of the takeaways I took from this. I want to thank you, gentlemen. I want to thank you for your time and for the wisdom that you shared with a number of elders and young pastors, etc.
Hey, Matt.
And Lord willing.
Can I stick a plug in here for Don and Bob? I really think these young preachers in particular need to invite these guys in, even if they have to get somebody else like Don's doing to pay for it. These young guys, we don't have a North American convention anymore. There's the way that we get together and spend time together with the young guys that were really important to me, because I had guys like old Joe Dampier and Hugh Sensabaugh and other guys who just adopted me into their family almost and looked after me. It's really important to have people like Bob and Don who as a contact to encourage and to bear each other's burdens and to encourage. I really think that we need to give them a little promo here, and not just for them, but for the young preachers that we pray for that are coming up.
Yeah, if you gents would give a little plug. Bob, you do a lot of mentoring. Where can people go to find you to reach out and maybe go to a retreat or whatnot?
Yeah, I conduct mentoring retreats for preachers. I limit it to just 8 guys so there can be interaction and some one-on-one mentoring. And they can register for that retreat by going to my website, bobrussell.org, and there's a tab there that they can click on about retreats and fill out the form, and I hope they can come.
All right. Don, what about you?
Yeah, what we try to do is we provide retreats for couples. We believe if we can encourage and support their marriage and encourage their marriage, it'll also help with their ministry. They can go on our website, accelerate.group, ACCELERATE.group, and there's a link there that they can sign up for the retreats that we have. It's free of charge, and we want to pour into them and bless them in any way we can.
And I would greatly encourage both of those. I've had the pleasure of having breakfast with Bob Russell, and I've had the pleasure of sitting down with Don, and the more pleasure of sitting down with Sue at lunch. And but Don and Sue and Bob can pour in a lot of wisdom into your ministry. Ken, I know you're working for the Solomon Foundation, but you also teach at Southeast Christian. So anything you want to plug?
I'm very involved in as a volunteer at Southeast, and of course I work with E2 elders on the bench. There are 4 guys that are a resource to E2 elders with their video and with their written stuff. most of my work with the Solomon Foundation is on site with pastors and their churches and online.
And talk a little bit more about that, Ken, because what the Solomon Foundation does, because it's very important, because as I said, the evangelical church in America is shrinking, but the restoration movement is growing, and Solomon is a big part of that.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be affiliated with the Solomon Foundation. It is such a wonderful resource for the restoration movement, keeping the plea alive in this generation. And Doug Crozier, the CEO, is just he's just got such a heart for our churches, for the restoration movement, and my work is to pastor pastors, to mentor pastors, and then he added to the staff Dr. Wes Beavis, who is a clinical psychologist. He's a restoration movement guy. I knew his daddy very well, and he was a restoration preacher in the Peoria, Illinois area when I was around Lincoln, and so those resources of Dr. West he drills down deeply with the pastors, with marriage issues, with self-esteem issues. He's as a clinical psychologist, he brings that to the table. I'm more work with them in the area of their church health and their ministry, church growth, and so it's more professional than personal, I guess you would say.
Well, and we'd love to have Dr. Wes on with you guys at some point, because I don't know about you gentlemen, but it's become increasingly difficult to find good counselors to send people from at my church to. But Dr. Wes is a godly man, and so that's always, a help, and he's always willing to meet with people, via Zoom and so forth. But definitely check out the Solomon Foundation. I'm biased because my wife also works for them, and Don, you're on the board, and so it's check that out. And Dad, for you, I'm reluctant to tell Gen Z to check out your sermons, but they can find them on YouTube and ChristCommunityChurch.net. You will be offended, but you will learn something at the same time. You want to respond to that or no?
No, you speak the truth. Just make sure it's love. Yeah.
Okay.
I was a high school kid at Hanging Rock Christian Assembly in West Lebanon, Indiana, when Scott Rawlings was a young minister in Hoopeston, Illinois, at the Prairie Green Church, and he's got a stake in me. He's got an investment in my life. Thank you, brother.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you for turning in to the Senior Pastor Podcast. We ask that you tune in later. We'll have more to say on everything from vision casting to strategic plans to you preaching, especially. This will be for Don, preaching to men, which not a lot of pastors focus on. And so we'll be focusing on all of that in future episodes, Lord willing. So thank you for tuning in, and God bless.
This has been the Senior Pastor Podcast, a production of 1801 Media Incorporated. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.